Persona is a video game franchise primarily developed and published by Atlus. The first game, Revelations Persona, was released in 1996, and between all of these games, Atlus has released 4 other mainline titles in the series: Persona 2, 3, 4, and 5. These games can be best described as a JRPG/visual novel, where gameplay is split into typical video game shenanigans and reading. A lot of reading. Like, I'm talking 40 to 60 hours of reading. If you don't know what a JRPG is, it's fine. The part we're going to focus on is the story and symbolism. Symbolism, for those unaware, is defined as the use of symbols to represent ideas or qualities. In video games, symbolism can come through gameplay, character design, level design, setting, dialogue, and even music. As you've just seen, Persona uses all of these, but again, we're just going to go over the story, and more specifically, the themes. Each game exists within its own little continuity, but they all revolve around 3 concepts in psychology. The ego is the concept of the self and how it perceives itself in relation to the world. The persona is the concept of the mask. It's a personality created by the ego to protect itself and its shadow from being perceived by others. The shadow is the concept of the true self, the personality that the ego refuses and is ashamed of. Psychiatrist Carl Jung defined the shadow as the unconscious, repressed aspect of somebody that does not line up with who that person wants to be. In the psychoanalytic sense, the ego fights back against their own shadow, even though they're both part of the same person. The 4th game in the Persona series symbolizes this very well. For the characters to obtain their persona in this game, they must fight a monstrous version of their shadow and eventually accept their shadow as a part of them. When that happens, their shadow turns into their persona, and in a way, the ego and the shadow become allowed to protect the self. Each game in the Persona series follow the same gameplay formula. Use a persona's magical powers to fight shadows, but each game symbolizes the relationship between the ego and the shadow in their own way. We've already discussed how Persona 4 has done this. Let's see how Persona 3 and Persona 5 relate the ego and the shadow to each of their themes. In the city of Iwatadai, there's a strange phenomenon called the Dark Hour. It's an extra 25th hour of the day that most people aren't conscious of. In this game, shadows represent death itself, and they come out during the Dark Hour to eat people's will to live. Our playable characters in this game are part of the Special Extracurricular Execution Squad, and their goal is to fight shadows and put an end to the Dark Hour. But if the shadows are death, how could they possibly beat it? Well, the shadow is still part of the ego, so they're not death itself, but the reality of death for the ego that it doesn't want to accept. Unlike Persona 4, Persona 3 doesn't quite give ego and shadow the reconciliation you'd expect. In order to summon your persona in Persona 3, you need to experience enough severe mental trauma that your brain thinks it's dying. And how do the characters in Persona 3 do this?
Persona.
Yeah, they use a fake gun to trick their ego to manifest itself into mythological beings to save itself from dying. Persona 3 symbolizes the most human struggle that every living and dead person has experienced, the will to prevent death, to survive. Notice how different Persona 3's theme is to Persona 4's, yet both games use the same concept of ego and shadow to symbolize them. In modern-day Tokyo, a normal high school student stumbles upon the metaverse, a manifestation of the collective unconscious, where people's shadows appear apart from themselves. In this game, shadows represent the shameful desires that are socially considered incorrect, yet we still have. Our playable characters are part of the Phantom Thieves, and their goal is to change the hearts of people in power by beating their shadows into submission and literally stealing their twisted desires to do harm. In Persona 3, everyone has a shadow of fear. In Persona 4, everyone has a shadow of themselves that they hate. But in Persona 5, the shadow is a desire to give into. For people in power, like politicians, CEOs, and even high school teachers, their shadows represent the desire to exploit their power for their own personal gain. But for the rest, like our playable characters, their shadows represent the desire to rebel against them, to take revenge against those who abuse power. Most people would just kind of lie down and deal with our corrupt leaders, but the members of the Phantom Thieves make a deal with their shadow that goes like this. 1. Fight back against the injustice being done to you, and 2. Your shadow will lend you power. Once this contract is made, they experience one hell of a migraine, and a mask appears glued to their face. And yes, I mean glued. They need to rip that mask off of their skin to remove it the first time. Once they do, their persona is summoned. Persona 5 symbolizes the intense mental and physical stress required to take off your mask to show others your true desires. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to allegory in the Persona games, and if you want to know the rest, you're gonna have to play them yourself. Although, I have to admit, these games are not for everyone. Actually, you know what? Let's talk about the reasons why you won't like these games. First, you may not like video games or these genres of video games, and even if you do, you may not have 70 to 100 hours to spend grinding dungeons or reading line after line of text. And being made from a Japanese company, they're filled with Japanese humor and anime tropes which some may not like, and depending on where you are in life, its themes won't connect with you. If anything that I said is true for you, then you won't be able to experience these games like I did. But through this video, I hope to have shown you how effective each of these games are when it comes to conveying its themes through different symbolism of the same three concepts: ego, persona, and shadow.